we're going to move on to our next speaker, Dr. Katelyn Gaffield from Kansas State University. And her presentation is the evaluation of U.S. soybean meal quality and consistency and determination of best analytical practices.
So thank you for that introduction, and I'm very excited to be here today with you all and have a chance to share some of this data as part of the symposium. As mentioned, I'll specifically be discussing research that we've been conducting, this large-scale soybean meal survey over the past year and a half. And I think the previous presentation did a really nice job talking about factors that may impact soybean meal composition globally. I am specifically in this presentation going to zoom in and focus just on the composition and consistency of U.S. soybean meal. And so as nutritionists, we all want a high quality and consistent soybean meal product. However, the more I work with the soybean processing plants, the more I realize how challenging that actually can be. And so one of the main factors that can impact consistency is plant-to-plant variation. And so in this figure by Gordon Denny and the American Soybean Association, we can see some of those different factors that impact plant-to-plant variation. And so geographical location throughout the U.S. may impact composition. We can also see the crush capacity size of that plant. So the larger the circle indicates the larger crush capacity of those plants. And also the age of the machinery in that plant, or those newer plants that are coming online as the industry expands, may also play a role in consistency and the composition. Now, I think when we think of variation, most of us are aware of the plant-to-plant variation, but there's actually a lot of variation that can happen within the plant, and that's because of all the different steps that soybean has to go through to ultimately become soybean meal. And so in this picture, essentially, anywhere in that blue area of the figure is the different steps in processing a soybean. So the soybean processors have to manage that incoming quality of the soybean and clean it appropriately. They didn't have to crack and flake that soybean to prepare it for extraction. And if that's not done properly, it could impact how efficient their extraction process is. We then go through the extraction process, which is probably what we're all the most familiar with. And then finally, it has to go through multiple stages of toasting, drying, and cooling before we finally get to that product that we're incorporating into our diets. And one of these factors that impact composition of soybean meal, we were actually able to evaluate back in 2024 as part of a soybean byproducts industry survey. And so essentially, as we clean crude soybean oil to prepare it for human consumption, we have to take out certain factors. And ultimately, during this refining process, we can produce some of the byproducts I have pictured here, such as soybean gums or soybean soap stocks. And what we can actually see from the results from this survey, pictured in the box plots, is that this actually did impact the composition. When a soybean plant was located adjacent to an oil refinery, sometimes those oil refinery byproducts got added back directly to that soybean meal. And ultimately, what that did was increase the composition of ether extract or fat in that soybean meal. So after this survey and the relationships we were able to develop with the 14 different processing plants, we wanted to take this a step further, focus on soybean meal itself versus the byproducts, and look at an even wider range of soybean processing plants. And so I do want to recognize that this is definitely not the first soybean meal survey that's ever been conducted. There's a lot of great research out there doing similar soybean meal surveys. This is just a few screenshots of different research that's been published throughout the years, looking at variation across different regions or looking at different analytical characteristics of soybean meal. However, we did want to build upon that in three main ways. So the first way is we wanted to provide an updated database. As I mentioned, and as we can see from that figure I presented earlier, the soybean industry is growing. We had a few new plants come online, and so we do want to provide the most updated and recent data possible. Additionally, we wanted to sample a representative population of U.S. plants. And so this includes making sure we're getting representative samples geographically, also making sure that we have representation across all the different size of crushing plants, and even taking into account the age of the machinery in those plants. And then finally, we also wanted to analyze as many key analytical measurements as possible that were both important to swine producers, but also generally across livestock species, and information that the soybean processors were interested in seeing themselves as well. So this ultimately led us to two main objectives for this survey, the first being evaluating soybean meal quality and consistency, and then that second objective was to determine best analytical practices when evaluating soybean meal. To do this, we ultimately had all of these measurements that we analyzed that I have listed here. So 11 different measurements, a little bit more when you factor in that bulk density and flowability, also included particle size, which I'll be presenting later as well. Additionally, as part of this survey, all of the analyses that I have highlighted in red, we also did a ring test with a partial selection of the samples and sent them across 4 different laboratories to really key in on helping provide some of those best analytical practices. Now, for the sake of time today in this presentation, I'm mainly going to focus on that first objective, focused on that soybean meal quality and consistency, where I'm going to present data and results from the measurements specifically just ran at the University of Missouri. And later on, we'll be focusing more in subsequent presentations and research papers on some of the data from Objective 2. And so we set out with a target of 30 processing plants, so we tried to double the amount of processing plants that we worked on in our previous survey. And so we targeted 28 solvent extraction plants and 2 extruded expeller plants. We had 2 different sampling time points, the first being in November of 2024 and the second of June of 2025. And at each of the time points, we collected 5 different samples across the time of a month, so about 1 sample per week. And I do want to take the moment to highlight that I'm giving this presentation today, but I do want to call out our master's graduate student, Sierra, as this survey wouldn't have been possible without her. Each of the plants that we were able to secure is an individual phone call, an individual email to work with them. So that takes a lot of time and effort to manage those relationships, as well as the many hours spent grinding soybean meal samples in the lab. So she's in here today, but find her after this presentation and ask her about the soybean meal survey as well to get her input on some of these other criteria. So I talked a little bit about our targets, but what were we actually able to collect? And so we were actually able to get samples from 27 different plants. 25 of these were the solvent extraction plants, 2 of these were extruded expelled plants. Ultimately, this led us to collect right around 270 soybean meal samples. And these were across 16 different companies. When you look at this on a crush capacity basis, those 27 plants that we actually were able to secure samples from represent around 40% of the entire crush capacity of the US. And then when you just look at the 16 different companies we were able to get represented, they make up about 90% of the entire soybean industry in the US. So we really think we did a good job trying to get a representative sample. Additionally, in this survey, something unique, having this larger sampling of plants, we were able to actually break down the plants by crush capacity as well, where we had 3 different categories. The smaller category being represented by 5 plants, which they would be crushing under 2,500 metric tons per day. We then have that medium crush category, which would be crushing 2,500 to 4,500 metric tons per day, which were 9 plants. And then we have the largest crushers, which would be crushing over 4,500 metric tons per day, with 8 plants represented in that category. And so here's a map representing the geographical location of the samples we were able to collect. And the darkest purple color represents 4 soybean plants per state, and then the lightest purple color represents 1 soybean plant per state. And ultimately, our goal was to get this to match up with that figure that I presented in the introduction as closely as possible, making sure that we were getting good geographical representation. Now, I do want to demonstrate, we did take pictures of all of these soybean meal samples, so I have quite the inventory of pictures that I can show everyone. But mainly, I wanted to set this up to describe what we're looking at when we think about within and between plant variation. So when we look at within plant variation, moving left to right, that's all samples taken from the same plant within the same time point. So essentially, from left to right, that's just a week apart different samples. Then when we go top to bottom, those are different individual plants. So the top would be plant 1, the second would be plant 2, and so on. And so just visually, as these samples were coming in, we can see that there is some variation in the samples just visually, specifically color and particle size that we were seeing. Now, I do want to highlight a couple of examples of between and within plant variation that we saw through some pictures. And so this is one of the examples that we did have some very consistent soybean meal samples coming in from some plants. And so here's a picture of one of the most consistent set of samples that we received. You can see within time point, those samples are very similar in appearance, and also between time point, we see a little bit of a color difference, but that's mainly based on we couldn't control the lighting between the two time points, but these samples were extremely consistent. Then we have this second set of samples that I have pictured here. This is from a different plant where we can see that there's some variation within the time point. And so we can see some color differences and particle size differences that are pretty stark within each of the time point 1 and time point 2 collections. And then this is an example of within the time point where the plant was fairly consistent. If I only showed one of the two time points, you would think that this soybean meal sample is very consistent. But then when we looked across the two time points, which were about 6 months apart, we see a little bit of a different story where we see time point 2 coming back quite visually darker than our time point 1 samples. Again, though, these were produced from the same plant where we tried to minimize any differences or ask questions about where maybe processes had changed. So now moving into the data for each of the analytical criteria that we measured, the first I want to present is moisture. And most of the slides and information I'll be presenting today will be in box plot form, either with plant or time point represented on the axis. And so specifically, I want to present moisture because the rest of the data I do want to recognize will be on an as-is basis, as when we're formulating, and I think most of our eyes are trained to look at this information on an as-is basis, but when we publish this information, we will also have the data on a dry matter basis as well. And so the variation we see in moisture is what we would expect, with most of the moisture ranging from around 10 to 12%. When talking with a few individuals about the moisture in particular, I think maybe we would have expected this to be a little bit closer to 12%. I mean, the soybean processing plants want to minimize how much they have to dry the soybeans in general, and so I do believe that this was a slightly drier crop year as well, probably leading to some of these slightly lower moisture values. Next, I'm going to move on to crude protein, and when you look at this box plot, it's pretty clear that our extruded expelled plants, all the way to the end, have a different crude protein percent as we would expect, with one of the plants being closer to that 45% crude protein, and our other being a little bit lower, closer to 40%. However, when we just look at our solvent extraction plants, the variation in the crude protein was fairly consistent. Actually, if you take all of the solvent extraction samples we collected, the exact average was 47% crude protein across every single sample. And so I think this survey, what we've seen, as well paired with the information that we've seen with the byproducts industry survey, is that plants have a good feel of what their crude protein percent and how to manage that, whether they're adding byproducts or how they're controlling the cleaning on the front side of the plant as well. We also broke this down by time point, and so we can see both of our two different time points represented. Again, fairly consistent when we boil down and remove the between and within plant variation. We do see that second time point having just a slightly lower crude protein percentage, but again, we would consider this fairly consistent with values pretty close to 47%. For the sake of time today, I have all of the individual amino acid values, but I don't have it presented here, but they were also extremely consistent across the samples, with our lysine percent being right over 3.07% for this survey. Now, here's some information where we were able to break down the criteria by the crushing capacity size. And in general, again, we don't see large differences. We see that smaller plant, though, maybe have slightly higher crude protein percent. And so when looking into this, this could be driven by a couple of different reasons. The first could be the regional location of where these smaller plants are located. And the second factor could be some of the other criteria that I'll be discussing later, such as the ether extract, as well as addbacks such as limestone. Now moving into another important criteria for soybean meal, which is ether extract. And again, the two extruded expeller plants stand out as they have a higher ether extract percent, as we would expect, with those samples ranging from around 9 up to 12% ether extract. However, I removed those samples from this figure so we really could get a better view of those solvent extraction plants, and we do see quite a bit of variation in the ether extract of our soybean meal samples, with some ranging right around that 1%, all the way up to samples close to or above 4%, which is getting fairly high. And so there could be a couple of factors that are ultimately impacting why we see this variation in the ether extract. One of those could be the efficiency of how they're actually extracting the oil. The other could be soybean byproducts, as I'd mentioned in my initial introduction slide. However, what was kind of surprising is when we broke it down by the plants that provided us information on their byproducts additions, we see that the plants circled in green said that they were actively adding byproducts such as gums and soap stocks back to the soybean meal. And then those plants circled in red said that they were not adding byproducts back to soybean meal. And unlike my industry survey that I provided in the introduction, we don't really see a clear segregation on if the byproducts are driving this difference in the ether extract. So this was definitely of interest to our team and was something a little bit unexpected. Additionally, I do want to note that the ether extract of these samples, taken about a year apart from the byproducts industry survey, did have about 0.5% higher ether extract across the board compared to our previous samples. So we were also intrigued that these samples came back consistently with a little bit higher ether extract than previous surveys we've conducted. When looking across time point, and I think that this is going to be a consistent message as part of my presentation, is we do see some plant-to-plant and within plant variation, but when you really boil that down and look across time point, the soybean meal samples are fairly consistent across our different analytical criteria, again represented here by ether extract by time point. However, it gets a little bit more interesting when we begin to break this down by the crush capacity size. And so we can see here that we actually appear to have a lower ether extract percent in those medium and larger crush plants than those small crush plants. Now, when looking into this data, I think that this could partially be driven by the actual age of the machinery in that plant, leading to differences in their efficiency to be able to extract oil. And so a lot of these newer plants coming online have would fall into that greater than 4,500 metric tons per day crush capacity, which could be leading to what we're seeing in this diagram here. Next, the previous presentation presented some information on sucrose. And again, I think this is a positive message when you think about US soybean meal. We see sucrose levels in this survey ranging from, if you exclude plant 15, which is our lowest, almost all of our samples were over 5%, where we see in other regions sucrose values that could range closer to 4 to 5%. And we see that's not just driven by one plant, but this is driven by all of the different plants that we were able to sample. Next is the neutral detergent fiber. And we didn't have as much between plant variation in this assay, but what you see is that this is probably the analytical criteria that we had the most within plant variation. And so I think in the past, we believed that soybean plants, or plants were adding soybean hulls back to soybean meal. However, all of the plants that I've worked with throughout the 2 surveys do not add soybean hulls back to soybean meal after processing. So the differences in NDF driven here have to come from that residual soybean hull from that initial cleaning process, making its way through the entire process all the way into that final product. Now, this could largely be driven by small changes in the moisture content of that soybean can make it much harder to ultimately facilitate that dehulling process. And so I think that's why we're seeing so much within plant variation in this specific survey. Next, I want to move on to trypsin inhibitor units, and I know that this has been a big topic within the swine industry and poultry industries recently. And the thing that stands out is clearly those extruded expelled samples had the highest trypsin inhibitor values, with values ranging over 10 up to 20 TIU per milligram seed powder. Additionally, we do see quite a bit of variation when we look at the trypsin inhibitor between and within plant. In previous research conducted at Kansas State University looking at trypsin inhibitor, if you consider about a 20 to 22% soybean meal inclusion into a nursery diet, if you have a 6 TIU or higher soybean meal source, we can begin to see some reductions in nursery pig growth performance. And so about 20% of our samples fell above this 6 TIU threshold. So definitely this is one of the aspects that we probably need to consider further in our investigating mitigation strategies. Also, one of the interesting aspects when we had all of these available photos is that trypsin inhibitor is an important analysis, but visually we were able to pretty easily pair some of the photos that we saw with the trypsin inhibitor values. And so our plant with the most variation in trypsin inhibitor, you can see that visually had the greatest variation in the color of those soybean meal samples over the course of a month. Additionally, that plant that consistently had the lowest trypsin inhibitor, pretty clearly in our data set, had the darkest colored soybean meal across the board. And then finally, I can't leave those consistent plants out. So I'm showing an example here of our most consistent plant. And clearly they had one of the most consistent colored soybean meal samples throughout the survey as well. So what we were seeing visually was matching up very closely with what we were analyzing. Now, breaking this down by time point, again, we see a fairly consistent trypsin inhibitor between our 2 time points, with the average being right around 5 TIU per milligram seed powder across the 2 time points, which would be consistent with what I've been seeing through some of the other trypsin inhibitor work I've been doing as well. Now, probably one of the biggest questions I've received from nutritionists when I began conducting this survey is on the calcium value, because nutritionists across all different species want to understand what calcium is coming into their diet so that they can formulate appropriately, whether that be from an ABC4 standpoint for nursery pig diets, or whether that's calcium and phosphorus ratios. And so I think the real value, despite understanding the variation here, is providing adequate loading values for formulation with this information from the survey. And so we actually did, surprisingly to me, have some plants report that they were not adding byproducts limestone as a byproduct back to soybean meal as a flow agent. And so those would be some of the plants at the very bottom you see with the lowest calcium percent. They would report no limestone added back. Where then we have other plants who reported adding limestone back up to their allowable limit of 0.5%. Now, breaking down the calcium values by plant, this is another area that stuck out to me that was a little bit unexpected, where we do seem to see a trend with the larger crush capacity plants adding more potential limestone back to the soybean meal. And so we can ultimately see that those largest crush capacity plants seem to be having the highest calcium values, potentially indicating this additional addition of limestone. And so this could vary for multiple reasons. Potentially, if they're more efficient with their oil extraction and they're meeting their crude protein percent, they could potentially have the ability to be adding back more of this limestone into the soybean meal while still meeting all of their other criteria. Finally, in one of the aspects that I wasn't initially thinking about when conducting this survey would be particle size, but it actually came back pretty interesting, where we see particle size ranging from below 500 microns all the way to above 1,200 microns. Now, we know the particle size of ingredients can impact digestibility, so that's something to potentially consider here. At the levels that we're including soybean meal back into the diet, some research would say that might not translate into differences in growth performance. But either way, when looking at particle size, this could be an important consideration when you think about manufacturing your feed, especially, for example, if you decide to pellet your diet. Now, I do want to take a quick moment, as I did provide some information on the analytical criteria, but I think the most important outcome of the survey is increased communication with soybean crushing plants. And so currently, now that we have all the data back, we're putting together information forms, essentially like this. It's multiple pages, and we provide all of the information back to the individuals who provided us the samples for the survey. Now, oftentimes, the main objectives of a soybean processor are pretty much inverse to those main objectives of a nutritionist. However, if we can begin to increase this communication through surveys like this, we can understand and communicate back to soybean processing plants what aspects are they doing best and they should continue doing, or what are some aspects that we can work on together to improve. Additionally, as nutritionists, we can learn how to better formulate with soybean meal and maximize the use, for example, if we have increased ether extract in certain samples. And so ultimately, I think that's the major takeaway from this survey, is just that increased communication and relationship between soy crushers and nutritionists of all different livestock species. Finally, I do want to recognize today that I only presented a very, very small subset of the information that we got out of this survey, mainly focusing on some of the compositional aspects. We have a ton more information that was produced from this survey that will be followed up in subsequent presentations and publications that range from additional key analytical measurements I wasn't able to present here today, also that ring test between laboratories so we can make better analytical recommendations. Even we're working on some NIR information as well. So a lot of information to come from this survey. Finally, I do want to take a quick second to thank, first of all, the Kansas State Applied Swine Nutrition team and everyone who put time into this survey. Additionally, the United Soybean Board for the support of this survey, as it was definitely an extremely large project to conduct. And finally, some special thanks. I want to thank, even though everything's anonymous, we do need to thank all the soybean crush plants and the producers who helped connect us with samples, as they trusted us to keep this data anonymous and present it in the best way possible. So I really appreciate that. Also, thank you to Gordon Denny, as he's been a wealth of knowledge on this survey, and Harry Krishnan for all of his work on understanding trypsin inhibitor values further. So that concludes my presentation, and I'll be around for questions in the panel session later as well.
Thank you, Katelyn.